And welcome to our keynote session. Before we begin, you may be familiar with this screen here. We at NOFA Mass are aiming to make our racial equity statement a living document that drives our work to heal the harm that racism has caused in the food system. We're urging participants to act as allies to BIPOC communities as we also improve in this area. To provide resources to BIPOC organizations that are working to feed their communities, be a partner and stand against white supremacist behavior and actions, work to dismantle racism within the food agricultural systems. By working together to dismantle racism in the food system, the Commonwealth can truly feed and serve the commonality of us all. And we acknowledge that we are on land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on this map and honor those whose land you occupy now. And you can find that link there and explore that map on your own. It's quite interactive. Huge thanks, of course, to our sponsors. Various sponsors support the work of NOFA throughout the year, and particularly the conference itself. So we're very grateful for their support. We couldn't do this work and many of our events without them. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our education director for NOFA Massachusetts, Caro Roselle. Some of you may be familiar with Caro. She holds many positions within the organization and primarily is our education director, and she will introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi, everybody. So nice to see you all tonight. So as Jason said, I'm Kara Roselle. I'm the education director with NOFA Mass, and I am so honored to introduce Eric Toensmeier tonight. I'm not sure if he knows this, but almost 10 years ago, Eric played an important role in the beginning of my career with NOFA Mass. I had been coming to the winter and the summer conferences as an attendee, but for the 2011 summer conference, I had my first insider role with the organization as a conference work study volunteer. And I was given the task of writing about the keynote address for the upcoming Natural Farmer. And Eric was that keynote speaker. And his talk that Friday evening, almost 10 years ago, was my introduction to the idea that agricultural lands, managed regeneratively, can help to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. It's an idea that everybody who's part of NOFA Mass is familiar with today. In fact, it's actually an idea that is familiar to the general public thanks to New York Times articles and documentaries, and even from discussion during the Democratic primaries this past year. But at the time, Eric was the very first person to introduce this idea to me and to a lot of us in the NOFA community. And it really did change the course of my life. I joined the staff of NOFA Mass a few months later, and I saw how our leadership, Julie Rawson and Jack Kittredge, were inspired by the potential of living soils to mitigate climate change. They began to make soil carbon sequestration a major focus of the work at NOFA Mass, which as many of you know, has remained so ever since. Those of you who know Eric's work should not be surprised that he was one of the first people talking about soil carbon sequestration in farming and food system circles. Eric has a unique ability to bring an organized and scientific mind and a skill for research to the topics of practice that he's most passionate about. Eric has studied permaculture, perennial crops production, and botany for over 2 decades. He managed an urban farm in Holyoke for 5 years and authored the book Paradise Lot about his experiences there. He is also the author of the book Perennial Vegetables and co-author of Edible Forest Gardens. In recent years, he has focused much of his work on soil carbon sequestration. That work includes contributions to the book Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, a recent paper called Perennial Vegetables, a neglected resource for biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and nutrition, and of course, his most recent book, Carbon Farming, a global toolkit for stabilizing the climate with tree crops and regenerative agriculture practices, which is widely considered the most comprehensive book written on the subject to date. What characterizes Eric's work is his unchanging focus on the importance of perennial crops in carbon sequestering agroecosystems. While we have made great leaps forward recently in the Northeast around expanding farmer knowledge and practice of tillage reduction, we have work to do still in increasing the percentage of our local food that comes from perennial crops, which have so much potential for climate stabilization and for the resilience of our farmland. I'm very much looking forward to what he has to tell us about that today. So I want to personally thank Eric for that keynote talk he gave in 2011 and for all his invaluable work before and after that day, and for what he will share with us tonight. So please welcome Eric Toensmeier.
Right. Well, thanks. That's very kind. And may I say thanks to NOFA also. That was the first gig I ever had on carbon farming. So it was a great opportunity to get to do that. I really appreciate that. I've been, coming to NOFA events and speaking at NOFA conferences, and I was a NOFA employee and stuff, boy, for, 25 years or something. So I'm very, grateful to be here, and thanks for saying those nice things. That's very kind. And this is sort of Kara and Jason and I met and talked through some of the stuff we might cover tonight. So we're going to take sort of a walk through, maybe the last 500 years and the next 500 years of agriculture in Massachusetts in a very light and hopefully fun and interesting way. Let me share my screen over here. Yeah, okay, so we're going to talk about perennializing agriculture, and people are starting to talk about the perennialization of agriculture and what that means. And so we'll just walk through some of this tonight, and in particular, some of the things that I think are like ready to go in a big way in Massachusetts for gardens and for farms, and some things that are sort of like coming down the pike that maybe we may be able to appreciate in the future. And I'll just say as a little reminder for all of us who maybe had botany class a number of years ago now, that perennial crops are those that live for 3 years or more. I like to say 3,000 to 3,000 years, and they might be grasses or herbaceous perennials. They might be trees or shrubs or vines or cacti, who knows, any kind of thing that's going to live multiple years. And annual crops are those that live 1 year or less. In terms of this particular talk, I'm sort of lumping biennials in there that live 2 years or more. So most of the vegetables we eat, most of the grains we eat, most of the beans we eat are all annuals, and most of our livestock eats are annuals as well. So the great majority of our crop production globally is annual crops, and they are lovely, wonderful crops, don't get me wrong, but there are some real challenges with annual agriculture. And for a deep dive, you could read Plowman's Folly, which came out almost 100 years ago now, 80 years ago now, which is still very much a relevant piece of work. And the big issue with annuals is with the plowing and tillage, where you get erosion and compaction and loss of soil carbon. And also there are these periods where there's no living cover on the ground and no living roots in the soil. And those are challenges. There's a number of other things. Wendell Berry has said that we want to go from about 80% of our agriculture being annual and 20% perennial to trying to flip that in terms of moving our cropping systems. And I think that sounds great to me. And we're also not ready to do that yet, but we can move in that direction. And I want to say also that there's lots of ways to make annual agriculture better, both in gardens and in farms. And I know a ton of people who are involved in NOFA Mass are doing this in their gardens and farms, organic no-till and cover crops and diversification and all the different things we do to make annual cropping as good as we possibly can, all go to address those challenges that were put out in Plowman's Folly. But that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. So all those things are great, and what we'll talk about tonight is compatible with those practices. I do both in my garden. But we're here to talk about where can we perennialize our farms and gardens now, and where do we hope to be able to perennialize our farms and gardens in the future, and what can we do to help make that more possible in the future. So one of the benefits of perennial systems is that the carbon sequestration is higher. This is almost all I'm going to talk about carbon tonight, but the more perennial, the better, especially with woody perennials like trees and shrubs. You start to really see higher carbon sequestration rates. This is from our new drawdown publication that just came out a couple weeks ago. which looks at sort of the emissions from agriculture and carbon sequestration as well on a global scale. There's all kinds of other cool benefits from perennials. They increase soil organic matter. And one of my favorites actually is that we found that studies have found that perennial crops show a 95% reduction in leaching of nutrients, partly because there are living roots in the soil all year round to sort of catch those nutrients before they wash away. In particular, some of our perennials here can grow in places that annual crops can't, whether it's too wet or too dry or too degraded or too shady. So there's sort of a complementarity, and they can grow in places where we might not want to grow annual crops anyway. And a key set of benefits is around climate change adaptation, like learning to farm and garden in the new world that is coming along. And there's a whole bunch of ways to do that. I won't go through all of them, but I sent Jason the slide set, so you can follow up on some of these references and stuff in there if you want to learn some more about that. I think it's particularly worth mentioning in terms of flood mitigation that perennial systems have a real benefit there in terms of infiltrating water and slowing down, helping to prevent flooding and so on. And I, just for all of you, I went onto one of those, this website on the bottom here shows you, you can pick your city and say, what's my climate going to be like in 60 years? And you can say with current, you can sort of change what emissions scenario you want to use and stuff. So I said, look, with emissions continuing as they are now, what's Massachusetts going to be like? Everywhere is going to be hotter, quite a bit hotter. And some places get a lot wetter and some places get a lot drier, which is really interesting according to, this is like a synthesis of, I don't know, 29 different climate models or something that they used. So really interesting stuff. I don't mind getting hotter, honestly, in terms of growing crops, but I don't like getting drier, and I'm not always wild about getting wetter. So it's useful just to have an understanding of where we're headed in terms of thinking about what kinds of agriculture we're implementing. And certainly many of us are finding that you know, the 500-year storm is becoming the 5-year storm and so on. So there is in many cases a real resilience to perennial food systems, perennial farming systems that does make them well suited to the kind of disruption and intensity that we're, you know, experiencing and that we're looking at in the future. And I wanted to go back to the past a little while. I've been, I'm in the early stages of working on a project with a group of indigenous chefs to look at what the Eastern Forest region was like before colonization in terms of farming, in terms of the ecosystems, and what that looked like in terms of food and particular plants and recipes and all that. It's a very new project, and it's been a real, it's already been a real learning process for me, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more that I will learn from it. And I wanted to just share a couple of insights first about the production of annual crops here. Essentially all of the prime farmland in Massachusetts was being farmed. That was either in, you know, crops or was fallow and about to return to crops. So like all of the Connecticut River Valley, all that prime land was being farmed, and very little of the other land was in annual crops. Really, land that was suited to annuals was growing annuals, and land that was not suited to it wasn't. And the kind of system with the hills for planting the Three Sisters, those hills were tilled. They were, you know, stirred up every year, but the whole rest of the field was not. All the spaces between those hills was not. And the combination of being on good soils and only plowing those hills, and also the legume component of the intercropping there, meant that people were able to go 7 to 10 years without fertilizing. And then the fields would be rested for, 10, 15, maybe 20 years, never allowed to return to forest, but in sort of a managed fallow with all kinds of productive plants in there, and burned every once in a while to keep the woody plants from really coming in so that it would be easier to go back to annuals again. Strawberries were often used in a rotation after the annual cropping phase was done. I've been learning a ton from this, and I'm looking forward to learning a whole lot more about what annual cropping looked like. There were also perennial cropping systems here. Often in fields, you read about trees like mulberries and plums that were found in fields that were basically, that's a kind of agroforestry called parkland, where you leave some trees in place, or where they, it's also similar to farmer managed natural regeneration, which is an African system where you just kind of allow them to come up. Like if you're eating plums in the field and you throw it on a pit and one grows up, and if it's in the right place, you allow it to grow. There were also orchards and berry patches and vineyards. And vineyards were especially common in this area. The Concord type grapes and stuff were very widely grown. And then in the wild ecosystems of Massachusetts, both the wetlands and the non-prime, the non-bottomland, sort of the hills and stuff, were very actively managed ecosystems for the most part. Were tended, were curated in such a way as to maximize production of food and to increase the production of plant foods and also of game. So the use of managed burning, for example, created these kind of savannas of chestnuts and acorns with lots of berries underneath. Lots of species were transported around. The groundnut, for example, didn't actually grow north of Connecticut, and a single clone was carried by indigenous people all the way up into Canada, into an area 3 times the size of New England. The single variety, which is an extra large tuber sterile form that doesn't even produce seeds. And there were also large open areas that didn't have trees at all. From Boston, at the top of a hill, you couldn't see a tree as far as the eye could see. And out here in the Connecticut River Valley, a lot of Northampton and East Hampton was an open prairie, an open grassland for game hunting. And wetlands were also much more widespread, because beavers had not been hunted virtually to extinction, because there weren't dams. We had free-flowing rivers and so on here. Wild rice is noted as being an especially very abundant food plant in the Connecticut River, which would have been curated very extensively by people. So this is a little bit of history of what this region was like, and how the different people who were here over time were caring for the landscape. And we'll come back a little bit, I think, to a few of those ideas and insights. And I'll just say that Native people around the East continue to do these practices, continue to raise these crops and eat these foods and harvest them in ways that maintain or improve the yields for the future, and are removing dams, and like the Penobscot in Maine, and are and getting access to more and more land in order to be able to do these things. So it's kind of an exciting time, and hopefully we'll have something to show. We'll have a publication on this maybe around a year from now or something, if we're lucky. So let's talk through some of the perennial production systems for this area. Let me check on time here. How am I doing? We're doing great. Okay. First, for perennializing annual cropping systems, there's a set. Basically, you can sort of do some perennials around the edges of your annuals, as windbreaks, as riparian buffers, along contours, to prevent erosion on sloping areas. And I'm personally especially excited about hedgerows for pollinators. They're relatively low growing, so they don't cause a lot of shade. They can have great benefits for beneficial insects and pollinators, and sometimes they may themselves be producing useful products, elderberries and different kinds of fruits and medicinal herbs and things like that. So this is something that is shovel ready, meaning we don't need to learn anything more to do this. There are farmers in Massachusetts doing these practices now. This is ready to go. This is ready for adoption. And actually there's, money from the NRCS EQIP program to help people do this as well. So here's one that isn't ready to do here at all. It's really new. The use of fertilizer shrubs. NOFA members have done such a great job of using nitrogen fixing cover crops. But another strategy very widespread in the tropics that really, I would say the US and Canada and Europe, not so much China, but in terms of temperate regions, we've just really failed to learn from the tropical example here, from the amazing work that tropical farmers have done in this area. This is the intercropping of nitrogen fixing trees and shrubs to provide fertility, to replace whatever you're using for nitrogen fertility now. Typically they may be cut down and laid down as mulch or turned under in the soil. Sometimes there are large nitrogen fixing trees that are planted in fields as well. Unfortunately, because we mostly grow summer season crops in Massachusetts, like corn and most of our vegetables, that's not a great match for us, I think. But whereas in places where people grow a lot of winter grains, deciduous trees are actually a pretty good match for those, but that's not our biggest kind of agriculture here. But anyway, in these systems, you would have hedgerows of nitrogen fixing plants. The one on the right there is our native senna of Massachusetts, which is an absolutely beautiful plant. I've never seen so many bumblebees on any plant in all of my life as this species, and it fixes nitrogen as well. Some sennas don't, but this particular one does. So that would be one place to think about. And this is something that is on us to try and figure out what this looks like here. We don't have a great model for this in most of the temperate world. So this would be something experimental, unlike, say, windbreaks or something. And then we have the intercropping of perennial crops with annual crops. And I would say that for gardeners, this is ready to go. We can do this in gardens. And there are some early innovator type farms doing this here, and it would be something that other farms could easily add in. This particular photo is from a site in Wales, not Wales, Mass, Wales, where for many years they've been growing crops like hazelnuts, intercropped with annual crops, and having very, very good success in doing that with potatoes, for example, and other crops. So I think that would be an interesting thing for more of us to do. And we do see farms like Simple Gifts Farms and others in Massachusetts starting to implement this kind of stuff, Astarte Farm as well. And I'm really excited to see that happening. And of course, you could use organic no-till in those rows and so on. There's no reason you have to do this with plowing or whatever. So I think that's a really exciting cluster of practices. And then we have multi-strata systems, which some of the permaculture people call food forests, which are really, again, this is a system that very much comes from the tropics, that people have been doing in the tropics for thousands of years. But seems to work well here on the home scale anyway. That photo on the left there is from my garden at home, which is, ridiculously diverse, perhaps much more than it needs to be if you're not crazy about stuff like that. So I would say for gardens, we're ready, lots and lots and lots of people are doing this as a gardening technique. And on farms, we're starting to see some early adopters of multi-strata systems. This example on the right there is Good Life Farm in Ithaca, New York. The tree rows are, Asian pears and apples and peaches. And then in between, they're growing things like perennial crops like asparagus and berries and stuff. And then they rotate poultry through to manage the understory. And that to me is a great example of like a very simple system. It's not complex. It's not that challenging to manage. And they market, they have a hard cider operation that provides a really great, very high value added product for on-farm sales. So that's a really interesting model of people starting to figure out what that looks like here. But that is really, you know, for new folks, for people who want to really go out and push and try new things. It's not yet sort of, we don't have a million examples on how to do it and models on how to do that and budgets for how to do that at the farm scale and so on here. I think there's a lot for farmers to learn from what people are trying in gardens in that way. But that's really for the out there wild and crazy kind of new producers. You know, grazing of perennial pastures is a kind of perennial agriculture. And I'll say there's this the Grasslands 2.0 movement, which in some ways is very exciting, where people are looking at trying to convert some cropland which is not well suited to growing annual crops into grazing, which can be a very good use for that land and will certainly sequester carbon and stuff. I will say though that because there's so much less food per acre with grazing than with annual crop production, we certainly can't do this with all of our cropland in the Midwest, for example, or we would have like 10% as much food coming out of there, and that would be a problem. But so much of Massachusetts is not well suited to annual cropping anyway. We have so many hills, so many rocky hills, that this can be a good practice, and absolutely shovel ready, absolutely ready to go. We have so many. This is old news really here, right? What I'm excited about for grazing systems here is to take that model, let's say, of good sophisticated grazing and add some trees in there. So silvopasture is the combining of trees with forages and livestock. For example, this is Lisa DiPiano in the middle there at UMass Amherst, who's got some chestnut and honey locust and persimmon silvopasture going on UMass campus, which is really exciting that students there are getting access to see that kind of practice. We see great carbon sequestration in these systems. The animals really thrive in the shade. And you have to get, just as with tree intercropping, you have to have the right kind of tree and the right kind of understory and the right spacing between those trees. Otherwise it doesn't work and they outcompete each other. But with the right species, we can actually see increased, weight gain among livestock in these kinds of systems. On the right there, on the top right, are pollarded fodder trees. Basically, certain kinds of trees, livestock can eat the leaves. Ruminant livestock can eat the leaves. So if you cut those about 6 or 7 feet high in the field and allow them to resprout, that's higher than the livestock can reach. And you cut branches and drop them down for livestock to eat, particularly during dry spells when pasture can dry up. Some of those tree leaves are extremely nutritious, and a lot of them are high in tannins, which reduces the methane emissions from ruminant livestock, which is also very helpful. And on the bottom right is this notion of tree feeds, like feeding things from trees to livestock. This is a farm here in Massachusetts, Walden Hill, where they collect acorns with machines, I think, like those golf ball collectors. And then they feed them to a network of pork producers and market the acorn-fed pork at a really high value as a very fancy pork product. So I think that's really interesting kind of livestock production system as well. All right, okay, let's talk about some perennial crops. Let me see how we're doing on time here. I think we're doing great. Oh yeah, okay, super. So some perennial crops themselves. First, perennial fruits. We've already got lots of them and we know that really well. We have a great, peach industry and apple industry and blueberries and cranberries and all that here. So that would be as shovel ready as can be. There are also a number of less commonly grown fruits that are very much worth growing in gardens and worthy of consideration by commercial producers as well. This is my friend William with Pawpaws here in Holyoke, which have a lot of challenges in marketing, but are not hard to grow here anyway. And then we have woody perennial staple crops. Basically here that means nuts and maybe like honey locust pods and stuff. So for gardens, we're absolutely ready to go on. We have all kinds of great nuts we can grow in gardens here. And we're starting to see some innovative farmers planting out more and more nuts for production, especially chestnuts seem really hot in Massachusetts right now, which I think they're probably our very best choice. It's worth mentioning that historically, before the chestnut blight wiped out American chestnut, 1 in every 4 trees in our oak forest in Massachusetts were chestnuts. It was called chestnut oak hickory forest. So it was a really essential part of the landscape and people's diets and wildlife's food and so on. So this is a landscape that is kind of crying out for chestnuts in many ways. Typically these staple crops for cold climates don't yield as much food per acre as if you were growing corn or something there, but most of the land where we're growing them wouldn't grow corn well anyway. In terms of dollar value per acre though, they can be much, much more profitable than corn. So, and they can be intercropped as well or grazed under. They have all kinds of interesting potential. So I'm really excited to see that starting to take off here. For perennial grains, again, this isn't really a grain growing area, but the nice thing about perennial grains is they might do well in some of our sloping and rocky land that is not as well suited to annuals. Kernza has been released by the Land Institute. I've grown some of it. The grain was pretty small and the yields weren't very good in my garden. But it is kind of the first one out of the gate for cold climates, and perennial sorghum is very close. Actually, the Experimental Farm Network catalog is offering seeds of this one in this photo, a perennial sorghum that survived the winter in New Jersey, which is the closest thing we've got. I've tried a number of perennial sorghums here that haven't succeeded. So I'm excited to grow this in my front yard next year and see if we're ready for perennial sorghum in Massachusetts. Outside of Massachusetts, there's a perennial rice variety, which is yielding extremely well. I think it's in its 5th year now and continuing to grow really strong. So the revolution is sort of arriving on perennial rice in China and Southeast Asia, but that's not likely to survive winters here in any way. So this is kind of where we are on perennial grains at the moment. My favorite perennial staple crop for here, and that absolutely nobody is doing anything with as far as I know. I make it at home sometimes. There's one commercial facility in France. Leaf protein concentrate is basically a kind of cheese or tofu that you make from certain kinds of leaves. You juice the leaves and then simmer it and coagulate out the protein, just like if you're making your own cheese or your own tofu. So it's really high in protein, higher than a cheeseburger in protein, and has all the vitamins and stuff. It makes more protein per acre than any other kind of protein we can produce. So much more than beef, so much more than dairy, so much more than beans, so much more than soybeans. But it tastes awful. It tastes like wheatgrass. So you can mix it with things and that makes it taste good. You can bake it into bread. I like to mix it with hummus or with avocado. But I think in this, the early stages of this, it could be used as a substitute for soybeans in the diets of monogastric livestock like chickens and pigs and stuff that can't get everything they need from leaves otherwise. So, and a lot of our things we're already growing in Massachusetts, like grass and clover, produce leaf protein concentrate very nicely. So It's a pain to make on the home scale, but a sort of little regional facility can do a lot with it. It may be a byproduct of biomass grasses that are going to be used for energy or for fiberboard or something. I'm really enthusiastic about this. I think in 50 years, we're all hopefully in 10 years, some of us are going to be eating it, and in 50 years, all of us are going to be eating it all the time. I think this is sort of the protein source of the future in many ways. Again, it doesn't hold a candle to other kinds of protein in terms of flavor, but it has a real role to play, especially for livestock. They're not very picky about what they eat, you might have noticed. Then we've got perennial vegetables. We have lots of great perennial vegetables for gardeners. I grow, 80 or 90 species here in my garden on 1/10 of an acre. And I think for some asparagus, obviously people are growing, and rhubarb. I do think there are a number of other perennial vegetables that are really worthy of investigation by market farmers. And it's worth mentioning that some of them, including a number of the ones that grow here, are very, very high in the nutrients that Americans are sorely lacking, and that are linked to heart disease and osteoporosis and various kinds of cancers and so on. So I have a whole paper about this. You can see at the bottom there. I was fascinated to learn, for example, that our common milkweed has 8 or 9 times as much vitamin C as an orange. That's amazing on a weight per weight basis. That's super interesting. So I think there's some potential there. Then we have perennial industrial crops. It doesn't necessarily mean something that goes in a factory. This just means crops that we grow rather than for food. We're growing for materials, for chemicals, or for energy. And of course, there isn't enough land in the world to grow all the energy we need, and all of our, we need to reduce the demand for energy, be it electricity or fuel, electrify everything that's possible to run on the cleanest possible sources of electricity we can find for what the remaining demand is. But there is some role for some liquid fuels, and some potential to do that here. As some of these things come online. Milkweed is a great example because it has 2 different kinds of excellent fibers. Actually, there's a cooperative in Vermont starting to commercially produce milkweed fiber. It's very high in hydrocarbons, like those found in oil. And in fact, people have made gasoline and rubber and stuff from milkweeds in the past. The seed can be pressed for oil, and industrial oils is another category of use. And besides all of those amazing things about milkweed and its excellent vegetable uses, of course, it's an outstanding native plant for beneficial insects and pollinators, and plays an important role for monarchs and so on. So in my vision of the Massachusetts of the future, there's really a lot of milkweed all over the place. Okay, but really, most of those are not yet ready for commercial production in any way. And most of us are unlikely to make, for example, bioplastic in our own house from things we grow in our own backyard. Often, in many industrial crops, not all of them, but many of them kind of want that regional processing facility in some way. Although I have made bioplastic from acorn starch and stuff like that here at home, just for fun. And there are certainly fiber artists in Massachusetts who are using fiber plants and dye plants and so on that grow here. So it's not as though there's no potential there. All right, so how do you sell these things, right? Well, that's the problem with new crops, isn't it? So for home use, it's easy. You just have to find a recipe or learn how to cook it yourself. If you have a CSA, it's pretty easy because people are already used to getting weird stuff in a CSA. No, but none of those people ever knew what, a celeriac was or something before it came to them. So if you give them a recipe, I think that's one of the best places to start trying some of these new perennial crops. Some of our chefs are really interested in this kind of stuff. I think mostly wholesaling is not a short-term prospect for a lot of these new crops. Here's an interesting example. This Kelvin is one of my neighbors. He actually is one of the kids who grew up through the Nuestras Raíces youth program, and now he's a grown up and he helps me out here in the garden sometimes. He's got a yam there, a Chinese yam, which normally would be a pretty hard sell around here. But he and I have been bringing it from our garden to Puerto Rican grandmothers all over Holyoke, who all grew up with tropical yams. And they've been very enthusiastic about it. And I've been able to give a whole lot of seedlings to these grandmothers all over town who are very enthusiastically starting to grow this crop. So sometimes there is actually a ready market for some of these things, or at least a ready enthusiastic gardening base for some of these things. And I think the garden can serve as a research and development center. You know, farms are under so much intense economic pressure. It's so challenging to be a farmer. As a gardener, I have the luxury of trying things, of experimenting with things. My food security is not affected because I could just go to the store if everything died. My budget is not affected. My living is not affected. So I have the opportunity to try a lot of things here. And I think gardeners have a chance to really test things, to trial things, to work on developing improved varieties, or screen out and filter to find the best varieties of certain things that then we can pass on to farmers. I think that's a way that gardeners can support farmers. This plate on the left there is looks like July, maybe. What do we have in our garden in July to test for our we have these garden volunteer days and stuff, work days here. So there's edible leaf mulberry, there's edible leaf linden, there is some annuals in there. There's squash greens and squash blossoms. A lot of people don't eat squash greens. There's milkweed pods and fragrant spring tree leaves, and looks like maybe sea kale leaves or something there. So there is really, oh no, those are tree collards. So I've now gotten to have 100 or 200 people try milkweed shoots in the various different stages of milkweed that you can eat. And almost everybody loves them. That's not true for all of these other vegetables, but that's an easy win. And that's information we can start to pass along. On the right there, I think it's a great one for people to try. That's toothwort, cut leaf toothwort. It's basically our native wasabi. The leaves taste like watercress. The roots taste like wasabi, crispy roots. It grows fast, it grows in full shade, it grows in wet shade. And proper wasabi, to which this is related, sells for about $150 a pound. So maybe you can get 50 for this one, I don't know. But that is one of the things I'm really starting to tell farmers and foresters as well. Here's something I think that is ready to move up to the next stage for some innovative farmers and foresters to start to experiment with as a fully shade tolerant native food crop of Massachusetts. So I kind of feel like this movement for perennialization of agriculture, we're sort of where organic was about 40 years ago. We're very much in the early stages. We do have some things that are ready to go, and I think we should go ahead and go for it on those. We can use our homes, our home gardens as places to test things, and I think it's on all of us to support innovative farms. This photo is of Simple Gifts Farms, who are doing all kinds of really amazing, exciting things out here in the western part of the state. And I would say also that it's really for us to look to the tropics, where so much has been done here. And I will say, just on the carbon farming thing for a moment, so much of the airspace is being monopolized by better ways to grow annual crops and better ways to graze, so that you would think that was kind of the only way to do carbon farming. But actually, the highest sequestration rates are found in tropical agroforestry and perennial cropping systems. So really, it's we need to look to them and see what we can learn from how these folks are farming and start to apply those things here, and make sure that carbon finance for agriculture is getting to those farmers who did the least to cause the problem, are most affected by it, and are doing the most to fight it. And are receiving, the very smallest share of finance and assistance and market availability and stuff. think I have one more. Okay. This last piece is kind of going back again to looking at the what the land was like before Europeans arrived here, when indigenous people were farming and caring for the land. Is this notion that farming should fit the land. This is kind of more Wendell Berry there, that on prime land that is mostly flat, that's a great place to grow annual crops. You can do anything on that kind of land. You have maximum flexibility. As you get, into somewhat steeper slopes, some kinds of agroforestry, some kinds of perennial crops, good grazing, silvopasture are all great practices. And as land gets steeper and steeper, you have less and less options for what you might do. So agroforestry with low hedgerows and annual crops, perennial crops, although in some cases for mechanized harvest, you don't want more than a 10% slope for like mechanized nut harvest and things like that. And silvopasture systems. I have a grant proposal out right now. We've developed a really fun calculator that helps you figure out like the row spacing for agroforestry systems and stuff. On the one hand, you need a wide spacing in order to allow you to grow crops in the sun between the rows, but you can't have them too far apart from each other as it gets steeper going up the hill. So we're starting to figure out what the dynamics are behind that and building out this tool and stuff. Oh my gosh. And I finished exactly in 40 minutes. So right to the moment. So I'll stop my share and we can do some questions and comments and whatever. If you all want to just feed me the questions, I will do my best to not fall down rabbit holes of unnecessary and nerdy detail on those. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. That was very informative. And some exciting things happening in there. We do have some questions in the chat that have come up that we've captured along the way. So some of them go back to the earlier parts. One is from Robert asking, what was the name of that source for perennial sorghum?
Oh, Experimental Farm Network, which is a really cool project. Anyway.
Oh, I think so. I think that link was dropped in the chat. Okay.
Great.
Good. Someone beat us to the punch, I think. Great. There's a question here from Dale stating black locust is widespread in Northampton, but people consider it an invasive species. Is this something we should be happy to have around our garden area?
Well, if you have it, it's pretty hard to get rid of. I will say that it does fix nitrogen, and I think it's a pain because it suckers all over the place and it's really thorny. So I wouldn't plant it on purpose next to my garden or in my garden. But one of the things we've been doing in Holyoke is in the wild, where they are both native, the pawpaw and black locust grow together, and pawpaw grows in the shade of black locust. It likes some shade, it likes the nitrogen. So my thing at the moment is anywhere you see black locust means you should plant some pawpaws underneath.
Nice. Dale also asks, is monocropping of tree crops a problem?
Sure. If it leads to lots of use of pesticides and stuff, for sure. Yeah. Not maybe in terms of erosion, but in terms of other kinds of challenges. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Although you can get some nice diversity in the understory sometimes there in terms of like a nice mix of pollinator plants and stuff in with the grasses and stuff that can offset that a little bit. But sure. Yeah. Not wild about huge monocultures of anything.
Yeah. Another one here. I'm not sure who it's accredited to at the moment, but Jerusalem artichoke is edible, but not the best tasting, someone says. Is there any serious opportunity around these?
Well, first, some are better than others. I found that Clearwater was the best tasting one. Yeah, I mean, there's a good market for them. There's definitely a good market for them. I find pickling them makes them not tie my stomach and not so much. That's my 2 cents on that, but I'm not a commercial producer, so.
Yeah, I think someone mentioned something like that in the chat as well. Something along those lines. Great. Caro's asking, after you made Acorn plastic, what kind of object did you make out of it?
Sure, I made sort of like almost like fruit leather, just because I wanted to see how to do it, and that was a good way to dissolve it. There's some really good books on bioplastic. Now I'm not, oh wait, hold on, I have it here. Do I? Oh no, I can't find it. There's some good books and resources on making your own plastic. Basically, it's not much harder than making like Jell-O. You get, sometimes in fact, you use gelatin when you make it. You need a polymer, which could be like starch. So I used Acorn starch, so you can buy it like a Korean market. And a plasticizer, which you can use like glycerin. So very simple things that we have around or that we can produce here. It's easy to make, like, you know, buttons and little doodads and stuff. And what I'm really curious about is making like this string, the feedstock for 3D printers. I feel like that's the really interesting potential application for one of the interesting applications for bioplastics. You can make biodegradable or non-biodegradable bio-based plastic. And you can make toxic and non-toxic kinds of bioplastic. And you can make almost all, but not quite all kinds of plastic from plants.
Nice. Someone, I think this has been answered in the chat. Someone reminded folks that wasabi equivalent is toothwort.
Yes, and a particular species is cutleaf toothwort, the one that I like, Dentaria or Cardamine diphylla, which is like all over the place in the woods, all over Massachusetts and along streams and stuff in deciduous woods. It's all over the place. Unlike rose, which you have to really make sure not to over harvest very carefully, toothwort is like, grows like crazy. So it's much more suited as a forest farming crop in some ways, I think.
Is that the primary way of sourcing it?
That's where I got it from. I'm sure there's some nurseries that carry it too.
Okay. All right. Can you speak about nut oil?
Oh yeah. Yeah, actually, oh boy, what's the name of this place? There's a place that sells some really good nut oil in Massachusetts. Gregory Ormsby Morey, hang on. Forestopia is the name of the business. He sells all kinds of nuts and nut oils and stuff. Hickories, for example, are a great source of oil. And there are hickories all over Massachusetts. Hazelnuts would be a great source of oil for us. Actually, some kinds of acorns, like some of our red oaks, are really high in oil. And when you press the oil out, even of bitter nut hickory or of hazels, the bitter tannins don't come with it. So you get a sweet oil from those things. So yeah, I think we have some real potential there. I've thought about getting in a little oil press so that I could do my own oils like that from nuts one of these days. It's on the list.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. A bamboo question: is Massachusetts well suited for growing bamboo?
Well, not the good ones, not the good tropical ones that clump and stay put and grow 100 feet tall and have bamboo this big around. But yeah, sure, we can grow the running ones very well here. You just have to be careful because they will run and take over a bunch. They don't set seed more than once every 100 years, so they're not invasive in the way that, let's say, bittersweet is, but they can take over your yard and your neighborhood very aggressively. They can grow up to about, mine get about 25 feet tall, and they will run as far as they are tall every year. So they can spread 25 feet every year. So you really want to be careful. There is a native bamboo that grows all the way into New York State, not quite in Massachusetts, the river cane. bamboo, that would probably be the right one to do. We could almost call that assisted migration, helping it move north to deal with climate change. By the way, there's only about 2% of that left compared to what there was before colonization. So almost extinct, reestablishing that and helping it get going again, I think is a great project to think about. It's every bit as weedy and annoying as the other bamboos that can grow here, but it is more from here than they are.
Yeah. Well, thanks. There are more questions. If you're happy with some of this, some
Bring it
more.
on. Bring it on.
Popcorn style here.
Great.
Margie asks, and apologies, the bamboo question came from Carol. Sorry, I didn't attribute that question. And Doug had asked the oil question. So Margie's asking, can we put some research into tasty perennials?
Yes. Both in terms of species and in terms of varieties of those species, I think that's really important. Like a lot of mulberries just taste like water, and some mulberries taste excellent. So that's an important thing to be in communication with each other about which are the best varieties here. And then of any number of what are the best tasting species and varieties in general, which is something I do here in my garden, but also, doing the breeding work. Some of these things are so little grown here that if you grew out 100 seeds of something, or if you got seeds from a couple different locations, different accessions of seeds, and grew those out on some of these things and waited a few years to be able to taste them, you might have the best variety in the world of that species. So there's been a lot of work on beach plum, for example, which is one of our native fruits from out on the coast. And I've had some wild ones that were pretty darn sour, but I've grown some. There's some beach plums I've grown that are really a very outstanding tasting fruit. So I do think there's a role in testing and trialing, and also in selecting and developing for all of us. Yeah. And again, perhaps something more easily done by gardeners than by farmers, or in support of farmers in some ways there. It's hard to farm and be a breeder at the same time.
Right. Jen asks, what are some good understory nitrogen fixers for pawpaws in backyards?
What I really love is our native tick tree foils. They're beautiful. Or ground bean as well are great. Nice native nitrogen fixers that can handle some shade.
Ken is asking for a top 10 perennial list. Top 10 perennials you recommend?
Of any kind? Well, okay. Chestnuts, mulberries, Asian pears, grapes, American persimmon, all the berries, all the berries, milkweed, asparagus, sea kale, which is sort of like a perennial broccoli for this area, Chinese yam. That's kind of 10-ish, right?
Great. How about referencing mulberry again? Sarah asks, does it grow this far north? Because it's not native, question mark.
Asian mulberry grows this far north, and we have a native one, the red mulberry, which has scratchy underside of the leaf and is not lobed. So like normally a mulberry might have leaves like this or like this, but red mulberry is like this, and it feels like sandpaper on the bottom. That's a native species. So it's hard to come by. Oikos Tree Crops offers it. It's one of the few places I've seen that offers plants of that. And the fruits are nice. The ones I've had are nice.
Great. There's a beach plum question here. The beach plums, you say you have that produce truly outstanding fruit. Have you propagated any of those from seed? And if so, did the beach plums produced by those second generation trees taste as good as the fruit from their parents?
I have not grown them out to fruiting from seed, and there's variability for sure. Yeah. Less than with apples. Stone fruits typically are more true to seed, but yeah, there's variation.
Okay. Well, we have I have a few more in the list, and I'll just try to get through a few more, and then we'll call it. So there's apologies if we don't get to everyone's questions. Eric, thank you for answering so many so far. This is speed round here.
Yeah, sure.
Robert Banning is asking, what is the specific name of the Massachusetts senna that fixes nitrogen, and where can you get it?
Sure, it's Senna hebecarpa, and it is available from like Nasami Farm and some other places. That's where I got mine.
Thank you. Vivian is asking, do you see any opportunities to include perennial vegetables and fruits in public school gardens or land?
Sure, I mean, a lot of the school gardens are doing, will have like blueberries and stuff in them already, so that's the easy one. I think in some ways the challenge for school gardens is just to get the kids to know where the foods they already eat come from. And it can be challenging enough to get them to eat any vegetables at all. So maybe trying to get them to eat weird vegetables is like later down the line. But because a number of them, like milkweed, for example, are really great for pollinators and so on, I think they may have a role in those school gardens as maybe supplementary food, but as a place to teach about pollinators and beneficial insects and monarch butterflies and things like that.
So don't introduce that plate of leaves and that you showed us earlier on the slides.
My son eats some of that stuff, but know your market. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Eliza asks, is there any sort of crowdsourced recipe site or even a cookbook for recipes using these non-traditional foods such as milkweed, etc.?
Sure. Well, this thing I'm working on with these indigenous chefs will definitely have a ton of recipes in it. Meanwhile, there's a forest garden cookbook from Martin Crawford in England, which is excellent. And my favorite one for our, Eastern, that's from England, but the Eastern native plants or whatever would be Billy Joe Tatum's Wild Foods Cookbook, I think is really great. She's outstanding.
Excellent. Thank you. Two more. Christy asks, when the harvested part of a perennial crop plant is its root, does that not compromise some of the perennial value of the plant in the landscape?
Yes, I would say it's no longer perennial at that point. Yes. Yep. And that's sort of something I've changed my definition on over time. I don't really consider the root crops perennial anymore. They can live for a bunch of years, and maybe there's a stand of like Jerusalem artichokes. There could be a whole bunch of them and you dig some. So the stand is perennial. And in some cases, you act like with that Chinese yam, you can cut the top off and stick it back in the ground and it'll grow again. But yeah, I mostly think those aren't really that perennial anymore. Yes.
All right. And John asks, what kinds of crops would be suitable to grow in Hampshire County, hills towns that a donkey would like? Trees that would go well with a donkey, any nut trees?
I've not fed donkeys. I don't know what they eat. You'd want to make sure you're not poisoning them. That sometimes certain kinds of livestock are, like you never want to feed wilted cherry leaves to livestock because they're really high in cyanide. And so I don't know. I'm sure they would eat mulberry leaves, poplar leaves, willow leaves. Those are easy ones. So you might try those. Linden. And if you coppice those and feed them branches, I bet a donkey would be very happy with that. Those would be like low risk choices to try.
Great, thank you very much. Very productive question and answer session, as well as an inspiring talk. I'm very inspired by the potentials to be developed in our perennial food systems and integration. I hope everyone enjoyed. And thank you again for being here and being our keynote as well. we're grateful for you, and we followed a lot of your work. NOFA has followed, like Caro had said, we followed a lot of your work into the carbon atmosphere, if I would use that word. And as you know, we've been champions of that cause. So yeah, thank you for
I really
that.
appreciate the opportunity to be here. Here, you know, and we do these, you know, when civilization returns, you know, we do these garden tours here in the gardens if people want to come and see what these things taste like and look like and stuff. We like work for an hour and then we tour around the garden and then we eat all the things that are ripe at that time. So it's pretty fun. We do them once a month. They'll be up again. That's at Paradise Lot, the Paradise Lot blog. Yep, that's all. Just I appreciate everybody. I appreciate y'all having me out, and you know, the carbon farming information and this body of information doesn't do anything if people don't take it and run with it. And NOFA just has a really great track record of taking great ideas and running with them on the ground and in the organizing and all the other work that you folks do. So I'm really grateful that you wanted me to do something on this topic, and I hope we'll see a lot more of it in the future.
Yeah, same here. I look forward as well. Again, many thanks to you, Eric.
Absolutely. Have a good night, everybody.
You too. Thank you.